All right, everyone. Good morning or good evening, whatever it might be for you. For me, it's actually quite late in the evening, but luckily I'm a bit of an evening person, so I'm totally fine at this time for me. So welcome to Azure AD for the Azure Data Services. So why this topic? Well, if you think about the Azure Data Services, whether you're going to go with, for example, using Azure SQL, whether you want to go ahead with Azure Data Lake, whatever kind of solution you're doing in Azure, whether you're developing your web application or whether you're building a data platform, you're most likely going to need some of these services. And on the data platform side, we have many of those services. As said, Azure SQL, Azure Data Lake, we have Synapse Analytics now, we have Cosmos DB, and depending on your use case, you might be using either one of these or even many of these. And of course, we have these services that we use for storing data, but on the other hand, we also have services that we use for working with that data. For example, Azure Data Factory or Azure Databricks. And the challenge here is that for each of these services, how we authenticate with them is done slightly differently. And depending on the service, you need to approach it also slightly differently, depending on the situation. So you need to know what you're doing. And that is why I created this session, because it can be hard to get that kind of full view of where you need to be going. So I will be kind of giving you an overview of how to get started with all these different services in Azure Data Platform side. So we're going to start off with a brief run through of Azure Id Fundamentals, just getting you up to track with what we're talking about. Then we're going to be looking at some use cases, in particular with Azure AD in conjunction with Azure Data Services. And then we're going to be looking at the entire landscape of Azure Data Services with that set that I just showed you and how we use Azure AD in each of those scenarios. So, my name is Heini Ilmarinen. I am a DevOps consultant at Polar Squad, which is a Finnish DevOps company. I am also a Microsoft Data Platform MVP and a Microsoft Certified Trainer. So I run some trainings in the Azure landscape as well. My favorite topic is probably architecture, and I think Azure AD fits in there perfectly as well, because it is one of those aspects of Azure that we need to consider whatever we're doing in Azure. And I am actually a mathematician by my background, and so always a bit of a math nerd at heart. And as you might see, I'm a bit of a serial doodler. That's how I've created my slides. But let's get right into the topic itself. Let's start with Azure AD Fundamentals. So if you think about Azure AD, most companies get started with, for example, Office 365 in the Microsoft world. And what happens with that is that you actually get an Azure AD. That is where all your Office 365 users are stored. But on the other hand, you could also get started with Power BI. And again, you're going to need to have an Azure AD. But just as well, you could get started with Azure as well directly without having Office 365 or any of the other services. But in all of these cases, you're going to need Azure AD. And you might see where I'm going here. Azure AD is really the central hub of identity for all of the Microsoft cloud services. And so what can we have within Azure AD? We, of course, the most obvious one is our users and groups. You have experience of this. For example, when you're logging into Teams with your account, you are logging in with your Azure AD user. But we can also have applications in Azure AD. And this is where we're also going to be looking at when we get to the use cases. A lot of times we have these scenarios that we also need application identities. And lastly, we can also have device identities in Azure AD, but that is an entire topic in itself. So we're not going to go there today. And there might be some sessions around this, actually. I didn't check, but that's possible. So I just want to point a few other things about Azure AD. A lot of times organizations don't start directly in the cloud. So it might be that they have an existing identity solution on premises. So they might have side by side also an on-premise Active Directory as well. And we do need to distinguish here that these are not the same thing. we can, of course, take our on-premise users and synchronize them to Azure AD. And that way, your users have the same experience of whether they're signing into their local applications or they're signing into Azure. They just use the same account, and those accounts are synchronized. But Azure AD and Active Directory are meant for different purposes. Azure AD is built to be using the modern protocols, so that it works over HTTPS. That means that we have OAuth to use and so forth. Whereas for Active Directory, we have completely different protocols like Kerberos and NTML and so forth, where we're not going to use the same things in the cloud. So there are differences between the two identity services, and Azure AD is built for the cloud. But the nice thing with Azure AD is that there are other organizations that also have Azure ADs for their company. And the nice thing is that if you're collaborating with them, you could then invite their users as guests into your own Azure Active Directory for your company. And that way you will be also able to use those users in your Microsoft services. So you can give access to somebody from a guest with a guest account also into Azure. And so here is kind of, I think, the minimum that we need to understand about Azure AD to really get into then how do we use Azure AD identities to give access to all these services in Azure that we went through in the beginning. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about the SQL side or data lake or whatever service. This is kind of the foundation that we're basing everything on. There's one little distinction that we do need to make here, and that has to do with the separation of management of Azure AD and Azure. So we need to really keep those two services separate in our mind, because, for example, even if you have full access and global admin access in Azure AD, that doesn't mean that you can manage anything in Azure. It means you can manage Azure AD, and same the other way around. So even if you have full access in Azure, it doesn't mean you can manage users or applications in Azure AD. So you just have to keep that in mind when you're working with these, creating users and things like that. You might not have the required access because there's that separation. So that is really kind of the foundation that we need to get started. And the point here is, how are we going to use those identities in Azure AD? And that's where we get to these use cases. And I separated them to two, and we're going to focus on the second one. But kind of before we get to the second one, we need the first one. So of course, the first layer is, well, we need to create and manage some Azure resources. This isn't really specific to the data platform side itself. This applies to all Azure resources. So the most obvious scenario is, of course, that you have a user that is going to create some resources or configure them or change how they're set up or add some settings or whatever that might be. For example, let's say you're just putting up one service, for example, in Azure SQL, or you're building a full platform where you might be then adding multiple different data platform services. The first point here is that if we want to give access to this user, that user has to be found in our Azure AD. So that's the core point here. And then when we're talking about the creation and management of Azure resources, what we're going to control that with is by defining Azure RBAC roles. So the Azure AD is first doing the authentication of the user. So it is checking, is this user who they're claiming to be? And they're doing that, for example, by checking their password. If there's multi-factor authentication configured, then there might be a second authentication method required, like using the Authenticator app or a text message or any of those other levels. But you get this multi-layered approach. But then it is the role that you give through Azure RBAC that determines what can that user do. And within Azure Role-Based Access Control, there are many roles that you could give to a user. But just a brief overview, kind of the three main roles are the owner, contributor, and reader. So the owner can do everything in Azure and also give other users access. So that's kind of the full, you can do anything you wish role. Contributor can do anything with the resources, but it cannot give other users access. So that's the restriction for the contributor. And then the reader, as the name kind of implies, can only then, of course, read those resources. It cannot actually make any changes. So you can get actually quite far with those basic roles, and then just adjusting the scope. Is it to the entire subscription or to a resource group, or what the level is? But if need be, you can also create custom roles as well. But in some cases, when we have our user creating our resources, more and more, especially in my work, I see that this is also done using infrastructure as code. So instead of going into the portal and clicking around and creating the resources through there, this would be creating these configuration files that define what kind of environment we want in Azure. So it would give all the configuration of the Azure SQL database that we want to put up and so forth. And there's actually many different tools for this. So for example, we have the Bicep from the Microsoft side, or we have Terraform or Pulumi and so forth. And a lot of times when you're using infrastructure as code, you might not actually have a user who is doing all this configuring, but instead you have some kind of service that is running these tasks for creating these resources. So for example, you could have pipelines in Azure DevOps, or you might have pipelines in GitHub, or whatever service you want to use. And again, we are in the same situation that we have to find an identity for this service in Azure AD to be able to give it also the required Azure RBAC rights that it needs to be able to create and configure those resources. So to do that, we're going to create an application registration in Azure AD. And this is something that you might notice that if you have access to Azure, this might not actually be something that you are allowed to do in the Azure AD. And sometimes you have to find the person in your organization who has kind of higher privileges in Azure AD and can create that app registration for you. But when you have this kind of service that is doing the calling and needs those rights, then you do need to create an app registration and you get a service principal for your application. But then you just assign the roles the same as for a regular user. You just find the app registration that you created and give it, for example, the contributor right that it might need. So with that, we get to our second use case, which is where you actually want to go and work with the data. So it doesn't matter whether you're creating an application and you need to read a data lake, or you're creating a data platform and you have data in your Azure SQL. It's kind of, there are similar patterns in place. So again, we have our Azure SQL as an example, and we have our user who in this case actually now needs to be able to read and write data to this Azure SQL database. So for example, they might be running the query select star from table 1, let's say. And when you're creating an Azure SQL, it is asking for an admin account from you. And what that admin account is actually, what it is a SQL administrator. And it is using the SQL authentication then as well. So this has nothing to do with Azure AD, but this is the default method that it uses for authentication. But after you have created your Azure SQL, then you can find this place called Azure Active Directory in the settings. And you can actually specify an Azure Active Directory admin. So in that way, you can actually turn from having SQL authentication to enabling Azure AD authentication. And again, when you do that, and we want to add some kind of user, that user has to be found in our Azure AD. I know it's kind of, I'm repeating myself here, but it's an important point. But then once that user is found there, then you can create your users within your Azure SQL as you would normally do. You just specify that we're using an external identity provider to do the authentication. And again, the user logs in through Azure AD. But even in this use case, we might again have the scenario that it's not a person who is reading the Azure SQL, but instead we, for example, have our custom application that is doing the calling of the SQL database. And yes, I'm going to get to exactly the same point that I got with our first scenario. So again, we need to create that service principal in Azure AD. And again, we can add that service just as we would with any other user. But here we actually have a third scenario, which might be that one of the Azure services is calling this Azure SQL. So for example, we might be moving around some data with Azure Data Factory. And in this case, when it's actually an Azure service, we should check, does it support managed identities? Because with managed identities, we're giving an identity to an Azure service, and then kind of that life cycle of that identity is handled for us. So we can have a system assigned managed identity, which is then tied to the Azure resource specifically, or we can have a user managed identity, user assigned managed identity, which then can be kind of, we get to handle that and say when it is, what resource it gets associated with. But the essential part here is that there's not quite as much management as with the service principals. So we've been working through these two different scenarios, the management layer and then the data layer. And then the question stands, how do we tie this all together? We just looked at one example, which is the SQL database. So now we're going to be looking at the entire landscape of Azure Data Services and where does Azure AD authentication fit in with each of these services. So we started with Azure SQL in our samples. And let's just kind of recap. We have two options there for authentication. We can either use SQL authentication, which is the default method actually, or on the other hand, we can use Azure AD authentication as well. But we need to go separately in there and configure it. And remember, in Azure SQL, we go into the SQL database itself to create the users and give them the required permissions. We don't do that in the Azure portal. So there's no kind of management on the management layer for these user access rights in Azure SQL. So it's a little different than other resources in that sense. Then, for example, we have the Azure Data Lake. Azure Data Lake is a bit different. You can think of it this way. Azure SQL is based on a service that existed before Azure, whereas Azure Data Lake was kind of natively built on Azure itself. It doesn't have the same kind of history. The Azure SQL authentication is what we have on a SQL server. So it's the same. And there we also have AD authentication. So it's kind of following in the tracks of the service that it was originally built on. But Azure Data Lake is slightly different. We don't have the same methods of authentication. Instead, we have few options. So we have the account access keys, which are the kind of the account master keys for your entire storage account that you have. And yes, you shouldn't really be using these for anything, any kind of authentication, unless you're just kind of testing out, but still don't use them. Because these give access to everything in your Azure Data Lake, and you probably do not want to do that. The second option is slightly more restricted, and this is shared access signatures. And this is where you create a temporary key to your data lake or storage account and specify what kind of access you want to give to that specific shared access signature. So you have much more granularity to controlling what can be done with that SAS token and what cannot be done. But these are slightly difficult to manage. Kind of the easiest way to manage it is programmatically. But if you were to have kind of many users and you want the authentication to be based on the user identities, it would be difficult to set up with these shared access signatures. So therefore, we do have a third option now. This didn't used to, well, this wasn't there originally when Azure Data Lake or even Azure Storage came out. So this has been added later on. And this third one is Azure RBAC. So within the Azure RBAC roles, the same as we were discussing the owner, contributor, and reader, there are actually some roles that are specific to the Azure Data Lake. So there is a data reader there, a specific Azure Data Lake data reader there. And you can find those different roles and decide whether you need a data reader, a data contributor, or what is the specific role that you need for your Azure Data Lake storage account. So you just specify the role that you want, the same as you would assign also regular Azure RBAC roles as well. So that's pretty neat. We get to use the same mechanism. Then we have Cosmos DB. Cosmos DB, again, is a little different, but there are some similarities to Azure Data Lake. So within Cosmos DB, we have the primary keys. So again, these give access to the entire Cosmos DB account. They are either read-write or just read. So at least there's two different distinctions. But again, you shouldn't quite be using these. They are kind of synonymous with the access keys in Azure Data Lake. There is also something that is more granular, which is the resource tokens. Again, these are a little hard to manage. Yes, you can specify more granularity, like what database can you access, what collection, etc. What can you do? Can you just read, or what is the limits? But again, they are not associated to any particular individual. But recently there has been added a capability into Cosmos DB, which is called a Cosmos DB RBAC. And this is where you can specify resource-based access controls within Cosmos DB. Note, this is not Azure RBAC. This is Cosmos DB RBAC. So it's different. And currently you can only do these roles and assign them using either Azure CLI or PowerShell. So you need to do that programmatically at this point. And then to kind of wrap things up, we of course might have some resources that we use for reading and moving the data around, like Azure Data Factory. And here, remember, we would use the managed identities. And for example, if we have a service like Azure Databricks, even though it is within Azure, it's not, managed identities are not supported. So in that case, you would need to create that service principal and app registration in your Azure AD to, for example, allow Azure Databricks to read a data lake. I also had Azure Synapse Analytics in that picture. And with Azure Synapse Analytics, it's a collection of services. For example, we have the dedicated SQL pools. There you would use the same approach as with Azure SQL. We also have the data lake connection. There you would do what you do within Azure Data Lake. We also have the pipelines within Azure Synapse Analytics, which are essentially the same as Azure Data Factory. So we would take that approach there. So you kind of have to combine those different bits and pieces to make sense of Azure Synapse Analytics. So here we have an overview of the Azure data services and what are the different authentication methods and how the authentication with Azure AD also fits in. The question stands, why would you use Azure AD and why should you? So I think the first point here is that, yes, this is how you can make sure that each user and application has their own identities. But on the other hand, there is also the benefit that then you can use whatever Azure AD capabilities you have enabled in your Azure AD to also apply to all those sign-ins through Azure AD to whatever service that might be. So we went through the Azure Id Fundamentals to lay the foundation. We went through the different use cases when we need authentication. And then we took a look at the entire Azure Data Services landscape to see what are our Azure AD authentication options there for the different data services. So I hope you enjoyed this session and learned something new. So thank you for joining, and you can always go and find me on Twitter and connect. Thank you so much.